Okay. So again, this is being recorded. My name is Mike Knuckles. I work for Cornell Cooperative Extension of Jefferson County here in Watertown, New York. Cooperative Extension of Jefferson County, we're a county-based organization for those of you who are outside the area. And what that means is we really focus on the presentations that apply to this county. But this is one that I think is generic enough that I'm really happy to see people from across the Northeast coming into it. And I think you'll get some great information out of this. So asparagus is something that's near and dear to my heart. It's something that I've grown for many years. But I will give a bit of a disclaimer though, that I am not a commercial grower. I'm basically a home gardener, though I do farmers markets as well. And I'm not on the level of some of the larger growers. But I've spent a lot of the spring collecting information on commercial production and asparagus. And so we're going to talk both kind of the home grower level, but we'll also talk some commercial considerations and some of the research that's been going on in asparagus. Now, I thought when I first put this on, I thought, how am I going to fill the time up? Asparagus, what kind of topic is that? But it turns out there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on in the asparagus world. Oddly enough, it's a great vegetable, and I think it has a lot of market potential for market gardeners. It's something that should be in every home garden for sure, and something that grows throughout the country. So we're going to get into the nitty gritty on that. So let me share my screen again and get back to the slides. So a little bit of a disclaimer. Let's get into the next slide. There we go. So a little disclaimer, I'm going to talk some pesticide application issues. And so we as a nonprofit quasi-governmental organization, we don't endorse specific chemicals or treatments. Secondly, it's up to you individually to get your pesticide license, read the label, follow those instructions. The other thing I'll note again is that I am not a commercial asparagus grower, so I am relaying research from different universities that has come up and information on these topics. I do grow asparagus myself, had my first harvest of it 2 days ago, and was very happy with the first green asparagus of the season. So that's pretty exciting. So let's talk about asparagus. This is an interesting food to me because it's been grown by people for since 3000 BC, 5,000 years basically. And the thought is the first people that harvested picked it because of its potential aphrodisiac properties, which is kind of a fun little factoid. But it wasn't really grown in home gardens until really the 18th century. And that's when its popularity picked up. There were some kings in France that decided it was worthy of their gardens. It eventually came to America, and now it is a staple vegetable around the world, basically in home gardens. Asparagus is a really interesting plant, chemically, biologically. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that before we get into the cultivation methods. One other little factoid that I think is interesting is that when you eat asparagus, it has a lot of sulfurous compounds, but not everyone can smell them. So those compounds are excreted in our urine, and some people are genetically predisposed to being able to smell those compounds. Other people can't. So if you go, what? I never smell anything in that. Well, that explains you're one of the lucky people that don't get to experience that after eating asparagus. So its biology is pretty interesting. It was originally classified in the lily family, and research since then has shown that it is not in the lily family, and it has been placed in its own genus. It comes from the Mediterranean, from a coastal environment. Now, that's really important when you think about it, because that means certain things, such as salt tolerance. It likes sandy soils, and it has a history that goes with it. We're not really sure exactly where it came from because it was cultivated so early in human history. So we don't know if it really did come from Italy or Greece or wherever, but it spread very quickly throughout Europe into Asia early on, and then began appearing in gardens. Asparagus is perennial. Now, this is important to know. It comes back every year. So once you plant it, wherever you put it, you are stuck with it at that point. And you need to plan ahead carefully about where the asparagus is going to be planted. If you screw up a vegetable garden one year, your tomatoes die, big deal. Next summer, you go plant them, right? When you plant asparagus, you are planting a plant that can live 20, 30 years. And with proper care, it will give you those beautiful spears that we all love to eat every single year. The thing we eat are the shoots that emerge in the springtime, the spears. They emerge when the plant leaves dormancy from the wintertime into the spring. As those spears mature and grow, they become woody and basically inedible. So the younger they are, the more tender that they are. Thicker spears actually occur on older plants with more developed root systems. So the age of the plant does affect how fat those spears will be, which the great thing about that is if you plant asparagus now, every year it's going to get better for you. The harvest is directly related to the size of the plant and energy stored the previous season. So what you did last year affects your spring harvest. That's really important to remember. So just because you're harvesting it in the springtime, you cannot forget it and leave it alone. It does need care throughout the summertime so that you get that great crop in the following spring. Asparagus is also interesting in that the roots can go 4 feet deep. They really penetrate through the subsoils and suck up moisture, nutrients from pretty far down. That has cultivation implications and has implications on how you water and how it deals with drought. Again, these are seashore plants that came from coastal environments where there was not a lot of water. So they are genetically adapted to pull water from deep sandy soils up into the plant tissue. And that's a great thing about it. Now, just because they're able to do that doesn't necessarily mean we should deprive them of all those good things, water and nutrients and all, because you'll get better harvest if we treat them better as gardeners. But they can survive some pretty tough conditions. At maturity, some spears have been known to, the fronds can grow up to 9 foot high. Asparagus can be a very tall plant. The flowers on asparagus are male and female on separate plants. That is important, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So the male plants tend to be more productive, and you'll see seeds on female plants that eventually go from what's pictured in this photo to bright red. So in the fall, those 5 foot or 6 foot, 9 foot plants will die back to the ground and repeat over the following spring. So basic requirements for growing asparagus. Ideally, they should be in full sun, but asparagus is interesting in that it tolerates some light shade. My asparagus patch is next to a very old elm tree, and it gets shaded in the evening, and it still performs beautifully. Mine's actually next to a roadway and it's in some pretty tough conditions, and I get asparagus every year, enjoy it, and find it to be a great plant. Ideally, if you think back to its growth as a beach plant in the Mediterranean, it likes loose, sandy loam. It'll tolerate droughty soil. It'll tolerate salt even. So you could plant this next to a road that's treated with salt and it will do just fine. But ideally it likes loose, deep soils, high in organic matter. And the key thing is they have to be well drained. So think of that seaside environment. It's not a marsh, it's a beach. Water drains away quickly. So you don't want these plants to have soggy feet. Like most plants, they do need adequate rainfall, 30 inches or equivalent. So for a home gardener, they need to be kept pretty evenly watered. pH, some plants, soil pH is a big deal. Not so much with asparagus. They prefer a pH near 7.0, so neutral, but they can tolerate a wide range. The literature reports the hardiness zones for asparagus to be zones 2 through 8. I honestly question this a little bit. I gardened in Alaska in zone 2 and never could get asparagus to grow there. It certainly is a zone 3 plant. Maybe I needed to mulch mine more or something like that, but definitely it will grow in zone 3 and into zone 8. The zone 8 requirement as well. So that's basically getting down into the deep south. I think selective breeding is changing that. And increasingly, we're seeing that asparagus is being grown in locations such as Mexico, Florida, Texas, places such as that. So again, I'm an extension educator, and I am not a commercial asparagus producer. My job is to take the research that's coming from the scientists at Cornell University and other universities and translate that into a form that's usable for you gardeners and for market gardeners, commercial growers that are out there. And I did a lot of research to see where the state of the art was on this. And like I said, there's a lot of really good research going on with asparagus, and it's coming from two places in particular. Michigan State has a super strong asparagus program. Penn State is another one that has a great asparagus program as well. And so I'm going to cite references in many cases from their publications. There are two fellows in particular. There's a guy named Ben Sperling at Michigan State that is an asparagus expert. Penn State has a guy named Carl Cantalupi. I attended webinars earlier this spring. So one of the great things about Zoom this year, one of the good things to come out of the COVID pandemic was that we were able to attend Zoom webinars throughout the country at different places. So I saw what the Michigan people were doing, Penn State and other areas, and there's some really good work being done out there. So of the information that I'm going to talk about, some of it can be a little bit contradictory. And think about, as I'm talking about these things, one, if you're a home gardener, some methods will apply to you that just will not work in a commercial setting. Your site conditions will make a big deal with this. If you're in a situation with sandy soils, you're going to plant asparagus a little bit differently than someone with really heavy wet soils. Your acreage equipment, so a backyard plot that's a single row, you're going to be able to handle that much differently than someone with 2 acres and a tractor. Organic growing is another consideration. Organic methods with asparagus are slightly different. I will talk both conventional and organic as we go through this. Interestingly, several of the presenters I heard claim that organic is not possible with asparagus in any cost-effective manner, but I know folks, including here in Jefferson County, who prove that differently. So there's a lot of different, like anything in gardening, there are a lot of different opinions, and I'll talk about the various viewpoints of these. So soils, drainage again is critical when you are planting asparagus. The crop can survive short periods of flooding, but if your soil is waterlogged, it's going to rot, the crowns will rot, and you're going to have problems. So sandy loams, and loams are the best thing. The sandier the soil, the more you need to watch drought conditions and provide supplemental water, irrigation as the case may be. If you have heavy soils like I do, I live in northern Jefferson County here, and I have heavy clay. So when I plant asparagus, I'm going to plant it a little bit higher in raised beds and do things to lighten that up to improve the drainage. So just because you have clay doesn't mean you can't grow asparagus. Just means you should take some steps to deal with the drainage and add some tilth to it, some organic matter. One thing that is not recommended, and I was surprised by this, is not to plant on what are called muck soils. We have those down in Oswego County, which is the next county down from Jefferson. These are basically very good soils for growing vegetables. They're remnants of wetlands. They don't work well for asparagus though, because during frost heaves, the crowns can actually come up from these muck soils and cause damage to that. The other type of soil that can be an issue with asparagus is with the stony soils, which can cause the spears to emerge crooked. So if you're a home grower, I don't care if my asparagus is crooked. If you're a commercial grower, however, that can be a big deal. That can be a disqualifier for selling to supermarkets. They want those perfect straight spears in that situation. And so you'll have to figure out how to deal with that. But for home growers, who cares? It tastes the same. So site consideration, some other things, you really do want to try and deal with level plots. So asparagus takes a little bit of time to get established. And if you have a slope or anything like that, you can see some soil erosion, which can expose the crowns or maybe even bury them, depending upon how it's situated. And that can cause problems for you. The other thing is with frost pockets. Now, asparagus as a plant is super cold hardy, but once those spears emerge in the springtime, they will freeze and freeze back. In fact, here in Jefferson County, we had a very early breakup this year, warm weather, and asparagus was popping out of the ground about 3 weeks ago. And I looked at the forecast, saw that we had 28 degrees the next night, ran outside, harvested all the asparagus I could find real quick to keep it from freezing because it wasn't going to survive the night. Commercial growers, what they'll do is they will actually mow down asparagus in a frost situation if it has been damaged by frost. So when you're planning a site, if you have a lot of options, avoid frost pockets because that's where those young spears will be damaged. So planting asparagus, if you're a commercial grower, you want something ideally that looks like this. So super sandy soils. This grower is piling the soils up on the asparagus as a weed management technique. Keep that in your mind for later. We're going to talk about cultivation methods. And at the end of the season, they'll then mow the asparagus down, level things out again, and start over. So that's one commercial method that's done. So this is an example of something in rocky soils. And in this situation, you've got crooked asparagus. So not good for a market. I don't know, my farmer's market, I think people would be just fine with it. But for wholesale, it would be disqualifying. This is where you do not want to plant asparagus. So this kind of situation where you've got compacted subsoils, heavy clay, standing water, this is the asparagus nightmare. Your crowns will rot and you want to avoid that. So site preparation. I debated doing this presentation earlier or later, and I'm glad I delayed it for a couple of reasons. One is, again, I got to sit through some very good webinars at other extension services and got some great information from those. The second thing is that a lot of folks want to plant asparagus immediately. And ideally, you should spend the first year preparing that planting site, getting the weeds out of it, getting nutrients into it, because this thing's going to be there for 30 years. So when you get started, you want a clean slate, a perfectly clean slate. So the first thing is to make sure that you have a stale seed bed. And this can be done through herbicides, can be done through tarping. So let's say you're a backyard gardener and you've got a small area that you identify for asparagus. You can put some black plastic down through the summer, rototill under it a couple times, or pull it up, rototill it, allow the seeds in it to sprout, cover it up again until that seed bank is exhausted. Tarping is a great method for doing this. For commercial growers, and actually even for a home gardener, cover crops can be another way of doing a site preparation. They can add biomass to the soil. They can increase the tilth. If you have legumes, they can add nitrogen. Really great way to do that. The key thing, though, is to eliminate perennial weeds and to eliminate any seeds in that seed bed. Grasses in particular, especially if you're organic, can be a real problem in most garden situations. Once grasses start coming into asparagus, it's really difficult to get them out. So avoid planting asparagus right next to your lawn where you're going to get runners coming into it. So maybe if you're a home gardener, at the back of a perennial flower bed. So that way you can keep the grass under control. Market gardeners, it's going to be a little bit different for those folks. And certainly anybody doing sizable acreage, you want to come through, eliminate all of those perennial grasses early in the year before you go through and plant asparagus. So if you're planning to do asparagus, start now for planting next spring. Subsoiling, we kind of talked about. So if you do have heavy clay soils, there are methods that you can do to promote drainage. Tiling, in some cases, if you really have some problems, it could just be as simple as double digging something. A lot of different ways to do that. Getting a soil test is another thing I strongly recommend. So for those of you here in Jefferson County or adjacent Lewis County, come visit us, and for 15 bucks, bring a soil sample in, 2 cups of soil, let it dry. We'll put it in a bag, we'll ship it to the lab, and we will tell you exactly what your soil needs to grow asparagus. That really applies to any vegetable. If you are in a different area, most cooperative extension services offer this, and they'll give you good recommendations so that you're not wasting money on fertilizers you don't need or that may be excessive in the long term. And you can adjust the pH and fertility based on those laboratory recommendations. Raised beds, if you have drainage issues, are something else to consider. I think for most people, we probably don't need them, but if you're in the right kind of wet environment, that may be the only option left to you. So for commercial growers, cover crops, these are some examples of cover crops that can be used. Sorghum, Sudan grass that's mowed down several times in the season. One recommendation that Carl Cantalupi from Penn State gave was planting soybeans followed by buckwheat. He also recommended a rye hairy vetch, Austrian winter pea mixture following that. The bottom line is try and get as much organic matter worked in, try and add to the nitrogen content as best you can with those cover crops while choking out those weeds and depleting that seed bank. Another method that's used by commercial growers, home gardeners, you won't do this. At least I hope you're not doing this, is soil fumigation. Now, I'm not real keen on this particular practice. I'm largely an organic grower. In a pinch, if there's some really invasive weed or something, I might pull out an herbicide, but I try and stay away from this. There is an issue with some asparagus fields with replant, where if you plant it once, there are allelopathic properties that cause asparagus not to do as well the second time. And what growers are doing to get around those issues is using soil fumigation. And what that does is it basically kills everything. If you are interested in this or have that kind of situation, call me and we'll get you in touch with the right expert who can advise you on it. Now, for your organic growers, there is an idea that's floating around regarding planting with mustard as a natural soil fumigant. That was thought to have helped asparagus, but there have actually been studies, Michigan State did those, that showed minimal influence on disease management. So that's not a great option, unfortunately. Varieties of asparagus. And this is changing constantly. The different varieties of asparagus are in flux right now. So traditionally, the standard is a variety called Martha Washington that goes back probably 100 years. It's a male and female plant. You can go into Walmart and buy the seeds for their cheap seed packets. And it's not a bad variety. It's not great though. It is less productive because it includes the female plants. The Cornell recommendation for New York State are Jersey Knight and Jersey King. These are all male varieties, so they're a little bit more productive. Unfortunately, they're soon to be discontinued. The breeding program for this particular series is ending. And I just read today in Cornell's Veg Edge newsletter that the university is doing trials on some of the varieties that I've got listed below this to determine what the next recommendation for New York State will be. So there's some Rutgers introductions that look interesting. My recommendation for Jefferson County in the North Country are some of the varieties out of the University of Guelph, Ontario. So these are super winter hardy, all male varieties that are bred for heavier soils. And the standard right now is a variety called Millennium that is grown throughout Michigan and different upper Midwest states as well. So I think that's the one to look for if you're looking in seed catalogs or going in stores. It's not as available if you go, let's say you go in Walmart or another big box store and look for asparagus. You're probably going to see Martha Washington just because they can produce it cheaply and put it on the market. And most people don't know the difference. But if you really want a good asparagus patch, look for these all male varieties. Look for Millennium. There are some European varieties that are coming out there as well that I think we may be looking into in the future. The breeding program on asparagus, there's a lot of work being done regarding low vernalization varieties for places like California and Florida, season extension, research into different outputs. So I think this is something that's going to change quite a bit as the years go on, and we're going to see some new recommendations come out. One novelty variety that I think a lot of people like is a variety called Purple Passion. I've got some in my garden. It's a neat variety. You can see it in this photo, the second from the left, and actually the third from the left is Purple Passion too. It's just, that's a blanched variety. So to make the point about male versus female varieties, if you look at this photo, this is one by the fellow from Penn State, Carl Cantalupi, who's just a joy to listen to. The guy lives and breathes asparagus. And so he posted this photo, and I think it's very illustrative of the issue with open pollinated varieties that have male and female plants. So the middle row has both male and female, the rest is all male. And you can see the difference in size and productivity between that. Another thing to point out, I kind of touched on this a second ago, is that white asparagus is not a variety, but it results from a method. So blanching asparagus by covering it to prevent it turning green as it sprouts out of the ground is how you get white asparagus. So early in the season, the rows are covered. Some people use black plastic draped over hoops. One recommendation, the Penn State fellow recommended cutting plastic barrels in half lengthwise and placing those over the rows. Traditionally in Germany and other countries, they would have piled soil up over it and then uncovered it. It becomes hard to harvest if you pile soil up. I'm not all that crazy about blanched asparagus. I know some people swear by it and love it. And so I think it's a personal preference. If you do like it, there's some great ways to do it. Chefs do love it though. So if you're a market gardener, this stuff does sell for a premium, probably close to double what regular asparagus sells for. It is a lot more work to do because you're having to cover it and then harvest it pretty quickly. So that's a consideration to think about, that workload that goes into it. So let's talk planting asparagus. There are two basic methods. One is seed started asparagus, and the second are planting from crowns. And I'm going to talk about how to do each of those, the planting methods, and the pros and cons of each after we go through the how to do it. So the first, starting from seed, is one way that you can get an asparagus patch. And if you buy crowns purchased commercially, that is in fact how those growers produce those plants. They're growing them from seed. They're not divisions or anything like that. This does take an additional 1 or 2 years for establishment, which is why quite often people prefer to use crowns. So I mentioned the Martha Washington variety. I picked up a pack the other day of 50 cents, one of the cheapo packs at Walmart for 50 cents of Martha Washington seeds. You can also harvest your own seed if you have female plants and plant them yourself. Asparagus will also self-seed readily, and commercial growers actually will plow under those self-seeded plants because they don't want the female plants in there. In addition, they won't be in the rows and they just cause all sorts of problems. So they tend not to let their asparagus go to seed in that case. The Gulf Millennium variety that I mentioned earlier is available from seed. One company that has, and I'm sure there are probably others, is Johnny Selected Seeds. 30 seeds for $8. So you're going to pay more for this particular variety to get it from seed. But this is indeed an all-male hybrid. So it may be worth the money to spend a little bit extra for that. Asparagus seed's also good for 3 years. So if you have some and you can't get to it this year, save it, use it next year. So greenhouse production, typically it's sown 10 to 12 weeks before the last frost. Optional to soak the seeds in warm water. You plant it 1/4 inch deep. The germination is in nice warm temperatures. You want it in nice warm temperature, 75 to 80, 65 at night. A heat mat's going to accelerate it. And typically you'll get germination in 10 to 12 days. These are typically sown in 2-inch cell packs. If you are a home gardener, and let's say you're preparing your plot and you're going to hold these through the summer and maybe even plant them in the fall. So if you're going to hold them quite a while, the roots grow very quickly. So they need to be transplanted into larger pots quickly. Basically 10 to 12 weeks before the last frost. So in our case, June, those 2-inch cells need to go outside. In the greenhouse, they do need moderate fertilizer. If you can see some yellowing with them, that's corrected with chelated iron. That's often related to the pH of your water too. And so make sure to keep them fed and keep them growing. Don't let them get too root bound in those 2-inch pots though. Make sure you get them outside. Planting seeds. So once you've cultivated them, the commercial method that's typically recommended is to dig a trench 8 inches deep and space them 18 to 24 inches apart. So you're going to make this W-shaped trench with a mound at the bottom that you're going to plant those seedlings into. If you planted that Martha Washington variety, you may want to space them more closely so that when you identify which plants are female, you can pull them out. If you want to. I just leave them. I don't care if I have smaller plants in my patches, but if you're going for productivity, that is a consideration there. The plants are very small when they get started. The depth of planting will vary, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. Depending on your cultivation methods, you may want to think about how deep you want stuff to go. One other thing is when you pile soil to the side of the trench, make sure you're not going 8 inches from the top of the pile of soil. Make sure you're going 8 inches below the actual ground level. Just something to remember. So this is what it looks like in a field planted situation. And so these ferns are 12-week-old seedlings. This came from Penn State, Carl Cantalupi again. And basically, as these grow, that soil is piled onto the ferns. And then they gradually get some size to them. The cultivation method here allows some weed control in the first year and helps really to keep the patch clean until they're well established. When you're planting from seed in this manner, irrigation is critical. These are very delicate plants when they're seedlings in this situation. So you do need to plan for that. The drought that we had here in Jefferson County last fall, for example, probably would have damaged these seedlings without irrigation. So direct sowing is a method that I've actually done before. I do not recommend it. The seedlings are really tiny when they first get started. You could do a nursery row or something and transplant them later, maybe something like that. But generally, I don't recommend direct sowing in any manner. And I'm going to stop sharing for just a second and show the screen. So these are some of the Martha Washington seedlings that, let's see if I can get it in the still, that we planted about 2 weeks ago. And so this was a 50-cent seed packet from Walmart. You can, hopefully you can see on the camera, I'm not sure, there's a little tiny sprout coming up that is the emerging seedling. So if you think about that in your garden, that's super difficult to see, right? So weeds, grasses, all of those different things that are out there, your asparagus might get lost and plowed under, or you might pull it as you're pulling weeds. So I really don't recommend direct seeding. So let me go back and reshare the screen. So the second and more common method that we see for starting asparagus are crowns. And this is the method that's been used for many, many years by commercial growers and is generally the recommended method for most folks out there starting asparagus patches. Crowns are available from nurseries. You do see them in big box stores, and the best value you can get is typically through mail order. For commercial growers, the really big asparagus growers will actually buy seed, send that seed to companies that do nothing but raise asparagus seedlings, get the crowns the following year, and then plant them. It's actually quite a big industry. Norse Farms, I believe, is one company, for example, that does that, that has asparagus. But there are a lot of companies out there that offer asparagus crowns. The key thing when you purchase these, make sure they're not shriveled, make sure they're not dried out. So if you go to Walmart and you buy the things in the plastic bags that have been sitting there for 8 weeks or 12 weeks, they're probably dead by the time you get them. So if you're really insistent on buying them from Walmart, as soon as they put them on the shelf, grab them, plant them, get them into moisture. Don't let them sit there and dry out. I recommend purchasing from catalogs, getting a known variety such as Millennium or one of these other varieties, Purple Passion, if you want a purple variety, different things like that. I think that will pay off in the end by doing that. Crown planting, so they have more energy to start with. All of those roots have energy, carbohydrates, and nitrogen stored in them. and those plants are able to better compete with weeds when you put them in. They are more expensive, about $250 for a heavy crown, so a really fat crown that's going to get started fast. You'll see them cheaper, $1.50 for lighter crowns. One consideration when you're purchasing them is find out if they are fumigated. With seeds, you're not likely to get disease transmitted into your fields. But when you're purchasing a plant such as this, there's a possibility that you may be receiving some asparagus disease or something with it in that, or some pest or something. So growers do fumigate these before shipping them. If you are an organic grower, you need to check into this and make sure that it's OMRI certified, whatever methods that they're using. So crown planting is 4 to 6 weeks before the average last frost. If you have crowns now, though, they can still be planted. They're just fine. Typically 18 to 24 inches apart in trenches, 8 inches deep. So the same spacing and everything as with the seed started method. For home gardeners, this is pretty easy. This is much more difficult when you're planting 2 acres. So what you want to do is spread the roots in the bottom of the trench and gradually cover that with a couple of inches of soil. The crowns will sprout from the very center of that growing point and continue growing, piling that soil on as the plant grows. When crown planting, you're not going to harvest these in the first year. So you're going to let them get established, let them sit there for a year, and then the second year, you can do a very light harvest. Seed started, you're probably looking at 3 years before you can do a harvest. So spacing, this is also from Penn State. This is their guide. Closer spacing will increase the yields in the early years, but decreases it in later years as the plants mature and they compete with one another. So you have to think about, do you want a really good crop early, or do you want a great crop later? Closer spacing also reduces air circulation and increases the possibility of fungal disease. So these are different recommendations that you can look at. These are the pros and cons of doing so. For a home gardener, I recommend taking the middle ground and doing like 5 foot between rows and 14 inches between it. Go in the middle. Keep in mind, these plants get big. So one of the mistakes that I made is I planted my asparagus next to my currant bushes, and the asparagus towers over the currants. It eventually starts falling onto them. And then I've got to go in and stake the asparagus to keep it off other plants. So keep that in mind where you put it. These are big plants that need space to grow. Commercial growers, the planting of crowns, the typical method is to maintain the crowns in refrigeration until you're ready to plant them. Don't pile them up. They actually generate heat as they're burning all of those beautiful carbohydrates in the roots, trying to stay alive. And as they generate heat, that's going to cause them to dry out and cause other issues. Another thing that's recommended, the Penn State fellow recommended this, is to separate small, medium, and large crowns, excuse me. As the plants grow, you want them of similar size so they don't shade each other. If you sort them out as you're planting, put all the small ones in one row, medium in another, that's going to help them get established better. You're going to open furrows with a 3-point hitch middle buster. So I've got a photo of that here. So this is a pretty deep furrow that gets started. Typically, what you want to do is do 6 rows with a 5-foot drive row between them. So when you get into pesticide applications, cultivation, whatever, you've got some space to actually maneuver with a tractor. So some differing viewpoints that I encountered on planting. I found this really interesting, but for the commercial growers, the consensus seems to be in some cases that rather than carefully spreading out the crowns and getting them in the hole, just toss them in the furrow, close it up, and done. Eventually the asparagus will figure it out and grow like it needs to be. So that's one thing I saw that differs from the generally recommended instructions. So if you're planting 5 acres, labor is an issue. I can kind of see this. Home growers, if you're doing 6 foot, plant it right. Don't don't just throw them in the hole. Deeper planting will reduce the total yield, but actually increases the diameter of the spears is another interesting thing. So planting depth, there's some different thought processes on this as well. Some people like shallow planting, particularly those folks that are using chemical controls for weeds. So you're not cultivating to control weeds, but you're spraying. And they get an earlier harvest because of that early planting depth. The soil warms more quickly. And the first asparagus is usually the most valuable asparagus. So kind of like the first tomato at the farmer's market sort of thing is the highest priced one. So that really depends on what you're looking for and how you want to sell and market that particular product. So this is another slide that Carl presented. And I think this is an interesting analysis where he compared the seeds for 2 acres for greenhouse production with seeds to using crowns on 2 acres. And because of the delay in harvest, um, the time to get established, things like that, that initial savings by seed starting, and think of the labor to start asparagus seeds as well. It quickly becomes a situation where the crowns are a better return on investment. So $20,500, 7,000 pounds after 5 years for seed started, as compared to 13,000 pounds, 35,400 in his analysis for using crowns in that situation. The other thing is crowns, per his recommendations, you can get away without establishment irrigation. I'm not sure I completely agree with that. I think it really depends on the climate, your soil, a lot of different factors that go into that. But certainly for seed started, those tiny, tiny seedlings will need much more care and much more irrigation than if you started with crowns, because that crowns will have a reserve of energy. They'll be able to buffer different weather patterns a little bit easier than a tinier plant. So fertilizing, new establishment, the general recommendation is 50 pounds of soil per acre in the furrow, and then you side dress with 50 pounds per acre when the plants are 6 inches tall, nitrogen. One of the presentations I attended, they talked about using starter phosphorus. Many growers are adding triple superphosphate in the furrows upon planting. I believe you should go by your soil test. So if you already have a lot of phosphorus in the soil, that is really what you need to go by, in my opinion. But again, there are different recommendations out there and different ways of doing things. Established plots, 40 pounds early of nitrogen. So this can be organic. It could be manure, for example. So provide it early in the season and then 40 pounds later per acre per year. Home gardeners, so basically you're going to follow the same concept. Very light fertilizer applications, composted manure, 10-10-10 fertilizer, those sorts of things, very lightly applied, will be okay. Now, one of the interesting things I got from Michigan State is there's a lot of research into how much nitrogen asparagus really needs. And the deep root systems are great at scavenging nitrogen from soils. We pretty much know that. And the researchers are looking at whether significant nitrogen fertilization is even needed. They have found that 90% of the nitrogen in the ferns, so those big 9-foot tall ferns that grow all summer, is remobilized back to the crown in the fall. So some of these recommendations may be reduced in time as more research is done. And I think your mileage may vary, so to speak. Look at how your plants are growing. Use that as an indicator if you need additional nitrogen. So cultivation, weed control, basically, and so keeping those grasses at bay. When you first plant the crowns or seedlings, you're going to fill in the open furrows as the ferns grow, and you're going to use that soil to smother emergent weeds. In a commercial production, this is going to be done with a row crop cultivator. So think of hilling potatoes. You plant potatoes. As they grow up, you gradually add soil next to it. Any weeds that sprout, you choke out under that soil, and the plant continues growing through that. After the first year, and this is where home gardeners have an advantage. So if you're out there with your hoe doing a 6-foot row, you can cultivate pretty easily and get rid of weeds. If you are doing a market garden or a larger plot with a tractor, once those ferns reach 5 foot or higher, it becomes very difficult to do tractor cultivation. And really, you're not going to be able to do too much during that fern stage. So for most of the summer, you're not going to cultivate. Any hand cultivation, if you're a gardener, and actually for mechanical as well, should be done shallowly. You need to make sure that any equipment that you're using has a precision depth control. What you don't want to do is dig so deeply that you're cutting into those crowns and the root systems, which can introduce fungal diseases. And that's a whole different topic, which we'll get into in a few minutes. So the planting depth also affects how deeply you can cultivate. So if you do decide to plant shallow, you're going to have a harder time cultivating those crowns than ones that are planted pretty deeply as well. So mechanical cultivation and commercial plantings, there are a couple ways that growers do this. Disking or rototilling the entire field in early spring before the spears emerge. So you're catching the dandelions and those perennial weeds that are on the surface. You're barely cultivating the top of the ground, and you're doing this early in the month, in March, for example, before those spears really come to the surface. Again, if you do too deeply and you start damaging the roots, that may introduce fungal disease, fusarium. The second method, so think back to that first photo I showed earlier, that really sandy soil. So people cultivate asparagus as it comes up, and they mound soil over the plant row as the harvest occurs. So asparagus pops up through the soil, they harvest it, they push some more soil up on it, and they keep doing that through the season until the tractor can't get through there anymore. Either of these two methods can be used to add soil amendments, fertilizer, manure, lime, whatever the case may be, for surface amendments. Weed control. So we talked about site preparation, and I will reiterate this. If you want to save yourself trouble later, prepare your site properly. Make sure that you've got a stale seed bed. If you don't do that, there are ways to deal with weeds in asparagus. Home gardeners, organic growers can use mulching, hay, straw, leaves, even, I don't like grass clippings because of the nitrogen effects, but even that is better than nothing in some cases. So mulches can help to control the weeds and keep the soil from drying out. Do watch that you're not bringing weed seeds in. In the springtime, know that any thick mulch that's there on your asparagus patch will delay warming of the soil and delay harvest. That may be something you want, or maybe you don't want it. So just remember that that's the case. At some point, you should pull the mulches off of the main crowns, though, so that the plants can get through them if it's a deep mulch. There's been a lot of talk about living mulches between rows, clover, rye, those sorts of things. And studies on asparagus have shown that it can reduce the yield as much as 50%. So the various researchers I spoke with do not recommend this. Um, it's a neat idea. It's not practical with asparagus though. Flame weeding prior to spear emergence is an interesting method that I've heard of people using, and that could be a control method for some organic growers in combination with cultivation practices. So let's talk pesticides and chemical weed control. Again, the warning is that New York State has certain laws. You need to follow the laws in your state. If you're not in New York, follow the label, follow the EPA requirements for it. There are actually very few herbicides labeled for use on asparagus the first year. So when those seeds started asparagus or crowns first emerged, they're a little more delicate, and the herbicides that are out there can kill the plants. Asparagus needs really to have that robust root system and to be a big plant so that it can weather the different herbicides that are used. The common methodology that commercial growers are using, so they're doing this in Penn State, in Pennsylvania, and to a certain extent in Michigan. Michigan MSU talked about this a little bit, is a pre-emergent weed control upon planting the crowns before spear emergence. So maybe you're one of those growers who wants to plant shallowly and get early emergence. Before the spears pop out of the ground, you spray with glyphosate and you kill whatever, a broad spectrum herbicide that kills whatever is growing there. So that would be done in late March, early April, just before the spears pop out. Selective herbicides can be used as well. Post is one that is approved in New York State. I just checked it yesterday for use on asparagus that will kill grass species. So that is an option for conventional growers. Broadleaf weeds in season are going to be harder to deal with because obviously you've got these beautiful ferns there that are sensitive to herbicides. You want to wait until the ferns are pretty tall. And if you do spray, target the base of the fern stalks and never the actual ferns. So this was a photo from Penn State, from Carl Cantalupi again. And I think this is a great illustration of what happens to an asparagus patch that gets overrun by weeds. So this is a first year planting. This was without a pre-emergent. By the way, Carl Cantalupi, the guy I keep referencing, he is indeed a conventional grower who loves using conventional methods, herbicides, and recommends that to most growers. There are different opinions on that, and this is his perspective. So he presented this, and this was remedied by mowing the entire thing down, applying glyphosate Roundup to kill everything in the field, and then allowing the asparagus to resprout in August. Not the best way to establish an asparagus planting, and I would want to avoid this. So again, weed control early. But if your patch is overrun, this is one method that you can use to get it back under control. Asparagus is a salt-tolerant species. Like I said, it comes from the Mediterranean, oceanside environments, but do not use salt as an herbicide. Please don't. I will say plant it by your roadside if you happen to live on a road where there's heavy salt applications. It can withstand it, but don't intentionally use it as a herbicide. It seals the soil. It affects the water penetration and drainage, and it's just not great in certain soil types, unless you live on a beach, for example, and then you have salt naturally. You can also, that salt can leach into other vegetables and kill them. So please don't use salt as an herbicide. Harvest, the fun part. So for a home gardener, harvest is pretty easy. The biggest thing is just to watch and make sure you know when your asparagus is coming up. I've talked to many people that forget about their asparagus patch. They get busy in the greenhouse or planting the rest of their garden, putting their peas and potatoes and stuff in, and all those little asparagus spears are popping up, and they don't see them until they're 2 foot tall. Um, Watch your asparagus patch this time of the year. Again, like I said, I've done harvested my patch and gotten some, which I have a south facing warm microclimate that allows the asparagus to pop up a little bit earlier. Know about when that asparagus is going to come up. Watch it so you don't miss that harvest window. It's really easy to do. So you want to harvest after the beds are well established. For crowns, lightly harvest them in the second year, for full harvest in the third. For seed started, you can lightly harvest in the third year and full harvest in the fourth. In the first couple of years, you're going to basically get 1 week of harvest from asparagus. Once those beds are better established, once the plants are bigger, more robust, you can get up to 8 weeks of harvest time out of them. And basically what you want to do is harvest them when the spears are still tight, about 7 inches long, pencil size or larger. Once the plant starts putting up really spindly spears, so think of the buds on the top of the plant. The first one's going to be the dominant one. It's going to be nice and big and fat. The next one's going to be a little bit smaller. The next one from that's even smaller. Once they start getting smaller than pencil size, you need to stop harvesting. Harvest should be done by bending the spears until they snap. Some growers will cut just below the soil surface. The problem with doing that is there may be other spears next to it that you can inadvertently cut, and that results in a lost harvest. So that's one consideration. Quite a few commercial growers are cutting below the surface, then I'll explain why in a few minutes. Your weather can affect the growth rate quite a bit. If you have a really warm day, some commercial growers are harvesting twice a day in their asparagus patches. And I love this photo. I cannot imagine being someone harvesting asparagus on this rig all day. Even though they're sitting down, I think my back would still give out. But a couple dozen acres of asparagus on this contraption going from row to row, picking it and harvesting it, you got to admire that. Labor obviously is one of the biggest considerations for commercial asparagus growers. Home gardeners, it's pretty easy. We can harvest it in a few minutes. But commercial guys, you really need to think about how that asparagus will be harvested. An example from Ontario last year. So during the height of COVID, as things were locked down and there were issues getting H-2A labor, migrant labor, when the border closed in Canada, it occurred right after or right before asparagus harvesting time up there. And there were multiple asparagus growers, major growers, that had to mow their asparagus down because they didn't have the labor to harvest it. So they were putting ads in the paper saying, hey, come help us harvest this stuff so we can get it into the economy. Labor is the big concern in asparagus growing. All the rest of it is pretty straightforward and easy. But if you look at these yields, Michigan State reports up to 2 tons of asparagus per acre. By the way, Michigan grows like 21 million tons or some crazy amount in the state. They are one of the top asparagus producers in the country. And so that Michigan knows their stuff. But can you imagine hand harvesting 4,000 pounds of asparagus? So for market gardeners, anyone contemplating doing this on a commercial level, you must address the harvest issues and the manpower issues up front. So tender to tough. So the tenderness of a spear has nothing to do with its thickness. Really fat asparagus spears, really skinny ones, can be perfectly tender. It has everything to do with the age of the asparagus. So a really tight, and if you go to the supermarket and you buy it, you want to look for tips that are very tight, tightly closed, and that aren't too long. As they begin to open, the tissue and it hardens, lignifies, and that asparagus is going to begin to get tough. So the old story about, oh, look for the arguments that people had over, look for really fat asparagus spears or look for the skinny ones, has nothing to do with it. It has to do with the age of the spear. Storage, asparagus has a very high respiration rate. So I treat mine like sweet corn. I harvest it 10 minutes before I plan to eat it. Fresh asparagus, the fresher it is, the sweeter it will be. The sugars that are in the asparagus spears, as that plant sits there, as it ages, it begins respiring and burning the sugars in the spears. So if you buy asparagus from a grower, um, try and buy from a local grower if where you can, if you want the highest quality stuff. And real gourmets know this. They look for local producers who were out there that morning just harvesting asparagus because there is a difference in the flavor. Asparagus that's grown in, let's say, Peru, flown up on a plane and arrives to you a week and a half later, will not have the same flavor as what you grow in your home garden or what you buy from that market gardener who just picked it that morning. Handling it is very important. It needs to be chilled pretty quickly to slow down that respiration rate. So if you are a market gardener, you want to harvest early in the morning, get it out of the field and get it cooled either through icing or hydro cooling. Now, I talked about there are a lot of opinions on asparagus cultivation, and storage is one of those things. I found a lot of different recommendations from the various universities on. It kind of surprised me how widely varied these recommendations were. So the most common recommendation that I saw was to store the harvested spears upright at 36 degrees Fahrenheit with as much humidity as you can get, 95 to 100% relative humidity. It'll keep for up to 2 weeks. If you're a market gardener, I don't advise keeping it for 2 weeks. Sell it, get it into the consumer's hands. They'll love you for it because it will taste better. If you do have to store it for any duration, it can experience a chill injury at freezing temperatures to 32 Fahrenheit. I've seen some recommendations to store it that cold. Then I ran across folks saying, no, don't do that because of this chilling injury. So it really depends on how long you're going to keep it. If you need to store it for a week, you're probably going to want to look at 36 degrees, but taking it down to 32 for a couple of hours, won't be a big deal. You do not want to store it in water. So a lot of supermarkets will do this, and I don't think it's a great practice, although for a short term, it's okay. Typically for market gardeners, you want to place it in bags for storage. Again, think sweet corn. Get it out of the field into the pot as quickly as you can for the best quality. So let's talk quality. What makes a good spear of asparagus? So if we actually had a state fair that occurred early enough in the spring, what would win you the blue ribbon? And actually, what will catch a consumer's interest and make them want to buy it, or your neighbor's interest if you're giving it to them? So again, spear size doesn't determine the toughness. The younger the spear, the more tender and better the flavor. So we had frost a couple weeks ago that I had to harvest asparagus that was up so it didn't freeze and die. And it was only like 3 inches tall, really tiny stuff. That was some of the best asparagus I've ever had because I harvested it when it was super young. Bent spears are considered disqualifying for many people. I don't think that's the case, but some people do. Wind damage is an interesting thing. So let's say you're one of those lucky people who have sandy soils. If you use a cultivation method where you're hilling up those soils against the asparagus through the early growing season, you can get sand that blows into the asparagus and it lodges in the top of it. And I've bought asparagus with this this in it. So you take a bite of it and you get this chunk of sand in it. So it's kind of, this is reduced by mulching. If you grow in clay soils, you're actually not going to see this quite much. So really, it's only for those people in sandy situations, and it's less common in untilled situations. So that's one consideration for commercial growers. Another consideration is whether to leave the plug on the asparagus. Now, I mentioned cutting asparagus below the soil level, and many growers do this, and there's a reason for that, and why what you get out of the supermarket has that tough end on it, because it helps to increase the shelf life. It's called the plug, and it also incidentally increases the weight of it, so they get a little bit more money for it. That tough woody end typically gets cut off. So the question for you is, how fresh is it? Do you need that woody end to preserve the shelf life? Will your customers pay more for asparagus that's snapped off at the appropriate growing point versus that really tough thing that's inedible? You need to know your market. For home growers, snap it off. That's the best thing to do. And so that you know what you're going to eat is going to be tender and delicious. Overgrown spears is another quality concern. So if growers let things go too far, the spear starts opening. Insect damage from asparagus beetle. And I'm going to talk about asparagus beetle. Freeze damage is the other thing. If your crop freezes, you need to mow it down. Don't pick it, and let it resprout when conditions improve. Summer through autumn. So once you've harvested in the springtime, you get what you need. The spears get tiny, below pencil size. You stop harvesting, and then it's up to you to care for that plant for the rest of the summer, because what you do in the summer determines what you're going to get next spring. So make sure they have even water. Don't saturate them. But if we get into droughty conditions, provide some supplemental water. They'll fare just fine through a drought, but to ensure the optimum harvest next spring, you really do want to give them some water if we encounter drought conditions. So survival versus a decent harvest, they're two very different things. It'll survive, but you won't necessarily get as much asparagus the following year. As I mentioned, new plantings, so particularly those that are seed started, they're going to need more water. So baby them in the first year. You want to leave those ferns all summer and allow them to die back naturally. Don't cut them prematurely. So this photo shows a commercial planting that in the fall is beginning to turn. There's still some green in that field, so that's a little bit too early to cut back. Those plants are returning that nitrogen, carbohydrates, all the goodies they accumulated all summer back to the root system. And that root system is what's going to give you those beautiful spears the following year. So another issue is the asparagus beetle. And Michigan State has done a lot of research on this. They're, again, one of the major growing areas, so they have a lot of concerns with it. I think their monoculture plantings exacerbate this problem, which is why they probably do a lot of research on it. But there are two species that feed on asparagus, and just like us, they like it when it's nice and tender in the springtime. So the common asparagus beetle and the spotted beetle, these will destroy young spears. So this photo is a nice one that Ben Whirling did that shows the damage on some growing tips. Can't take this to market. Not a good thing. The eggs are laid on the stalks in May, basically as the asparagus is coming up. So if you have this in your field, you could be eating eggs from this beetle if you're not careful. I know, nasty, but unfortunately that's true. Early damage can go unnoticed. You may not see these little devils. They have 2 to 3 generations per year. And so they'll continue to reproduce and gain steam until they get to the fall and over winter. So this is a photo of the eggs on an asparagus stalk, as well as the larva in the lower right. So this is from Jen Zavonetskaya, who's a research at Michigan State University, a young researcher there. And she's doing some work looking at survivability of these particular pests, some really great research on that topic. One thing she looked at was winter survivability, and where does this particular pest spend the winter. She looked at decomposing branches, stalks, tree bark, leaf litter, those sorts of things. And she found that most of these beetles, although they can overwinter in any of these situations, they tend to survive best in either the stalks of the asparagus or in leaf litter. So if you're planting, as I am, next to some trees, where some hardwood trees, or next to a forest, that leaf litter provides a spot where these little devils will harbor. So this asparagus beetle, there's some steps for integrated pest management. The beetles are most active in the afternoon. Small plots, in my case, home gardeners, just hand pick them. That's the easiest thing to do. As I mentioned, they overwinter primarily within the hollow stalks of the asparagus itself and leaf litter. So Jen's research at Michigan State showed that autumn mowing. So once everything is completely died back, you go through, you mow this stuff down, and you deprive this particular beetle of an overwintering spot. So you don't have a home for them anymore. The birds come and eat them. They freeze out. You're less likely to see this problem from year to year. Asparagus beetle is also controlled by predatory insects such as lacewings, ladybugs. Parasitic wasps are being used in some parts of the world. They're not commercially available yet here in the States. And birds will eat these pests as well. So once the asparagus harvest is done, I let my chickens into the asparagus patch, and I personally haven't had any issues with asparagus beetle, though I did have them early on, but I haven't had it since. If you're a commercial grower, keep in mind that food safety regulations apply. Although asparagus is exempt, generally they're going to frown on any animal life in a commercial garden. Now, Penn State, they actually discourage fall mowing, and this is where there's some contradictory guidance out there, in that they want snow cover to be trapped by that stubble to insulate the soil and to allow better overwintering. They also find that fall mowing encourages early soil warming and spear emergence. So let's say you have a warm spell, you don't have that mulch on, you've mowed it, the stalks, the spears come up early, and you get that freeze. So you've lost some of the crop because of an early emergence and a freeze. So this is the trade-off, the pros and cons of these different management techniques. So are you trying to restrict early emergence by keeping snow cover and those sorts of things? Or is it more important for you to control asparagus beetle and pests? There are insecticides that are being used for asparagus beetle. Again, follow New York State requirements. These are best applied in the afternoons on warm and sunny days when the beetles are most active. Commercial growers should consider banding. So don't spray the dirt in the aisles, just the plants. You really don't want to apply this stuff during harvest. You typically want to do it during the fern season. So think about there are 3 generations of this insect per summer. So once you're beyond harvest, you then begin controlling asparagus beetle through sprays. Michigan State has some really good fact sheets. I've linked one here. By the way, these slides will be sent out to all participants. You'll have these, and this recording will be made available as well. So commonly used insecticides, Michigan State talked about this. Pyrethroids, there's some research going into those. Evidently, they're pretty good at controlling larvae, but less effective with adults. And some more research is really required to get into this. Grandiva is a microbial insecticide that's not been proven or disproven yet. The industry standard among conventional growers is carbamates. Lanate is methamyl is another one. That's a restricted use pesticide. You've got to wear PPE, you got to have a license, all these things. Neonicotinoids I don't like because I like protecting bees, but they are an option for control of these pests. And organophosphates are actually banned for asparagus in New York State. So those are not an option for us. If you are planning, if you really have an insect issue with asparagus and you really need to use an insecticide, call us. We'll work with some of the commercial veg people at Cornell University to make sure you get a good answer. Small plot owners, try some of the organic methods and hand picking and some of the control methods, mowing, those sorts of things first. Pesticide applications. So obviously hand sprayer for home gardens, small plots. For a commercial operation, if you have that 5-foot tractor row, you can't use a boom sprayer. So the big arm that comes out next to the tractor that sprays down, asparagus is 5 foot high, you're just going to break your ferns off. So what is typically recommended is that you have a high powered mist blower that sprays through the ferns from one side, and then you go back and spray them on the other side to get overlapping coverage. Diseases, fusarium, crown, and root rot. These are exacerbated by poor plant health. So if you have really wet soils, maybe you're getting some insect damage, you have fertility issues, whatever the case may be, you're more likely to see some of these rot issues. And this is identified by yellowing ferns and a sort of red-brown vascular discoloration of the crowns and the lower stems. There's some fungicides that are being used to control this. And as I mentioned before, replanting on the same site is actually not recommended due to buildup of this particular fungus, which is why some growers are having to do soil fumigation. Home gardeners, not a big deal. You shouldn't have to worry about it. Plant it right, make sure the plants are healthy, and typically fusarium won't be an issue for you. One thing that may show up is a disease called asparagus rust. And this is one that occurs north of 40 degrees latitude. So basically New York State. If you're down in Pennsylvania, further south, you may not see this quite as much. It's more common up here. Yellow or orange pustules that form in concentric rings. The spores for this overwinter in crop debris. So if you have an issue with this, it might be a good idea to cut the ferns in the fall once they're dead, remove it, burn them, take them to the landfill, whatever, to get them off the property to help control that situation. There are fungicides that can be applied post-harvest in August. Some growers are using these two particular chemicals. Again, follow New York State guidelines. And there are some reports of organic growers using sulfur dust for this. Another topic that is being looked at is season extension. I think this is somewhat questionable, but they're looking at it in Mexico and California and places like that, where they want to continue filling their packing houses with asparagus all year long. So they're looking at varieties that don't need a lot of cold temperatures, low vernalization varieties that emerge later. They're playing with low tunnels in Canada for earlier harvest, so they don't want to import quite as much as they do. So Canadians may want to get their asparagus 2 weeks earlier. High tunnels could be a way to, or low tunnels could be a way to do that. I don't know for the average grower, certainly not for the home gardener, that this is really a cost-effective thing to do. If you do really want an early asparagus, though, it is an option to warm the soil faster, earlier, and get that earlier harvest. So let's talk market potential for those people interested in commercial growing. Asparagus is a high value crop. It's highly sought after in the spring. So if you think about this time of the year where we've been without locally grown fresh vegetables for a while, since last fall, and people are itching to get in the garden. They're itching to get fresh foods. They want to go to your farm stand and buy something, and that beautiful bundle of asparagus is sitting there. in most cases, people will pay the price for it. They'll pay higher because it's fresh, local, and it's the first of the season. And in fact, one of the recommendations in Michigan and other areas is to broadly advertise early in the spring. Asparagus is here in grand big letters to let people know that the first vegetable of spring is now for sale, and you can come get it to go with your Easter ham or whatever the case may be. We have very few commercial growers in the North Country region. Only one that I'm aware of in Jefferson County, and typically anyone offering asparagus for sale sells it. I have growers actually calling me, or buyers calling me looking for asparagus at times. And I think in most of the country, this is probably the case, unless you're in Michigan or one of these real heavy asparagus growing areas. Um, in general, for local foods, a local market stand, you cannot go wrong planting asparagus. It will be sold and you'll get a pretty good price for it. You pick is another opportunity that I think is undervalued. You probably need to show customers where and how to pick. But for people wanting to get out of the house after a long winter, this could be an option. And this resolves that labor issue of having to go out and pick 2 tons of asparagus. Local restaurants, especially for white asparagus, they really look for this in the springtime. Farm to table type restaurants value it greatly. And if it's available, they're typically going to buy it. CSAs look for it. If you have a CSA, you can sell it through that. North Star Food Hub is another option for selling it. Various co-ops look for it. Even some of the meat markets will. So in Lowville, the Miller's Meat Market, for example, offer them asparagus, let them put it in their cases, and they'll probably sell it for you. So it's pretty easy to sell with minimal advertising because people are looking for it. Now, pricing in Michigan, these are values that are reported there. So the folks that are doing the 21 million tons or whatever they do up there, that are selling to Birdseye and vegetable processors, they're getting about 75 cents a pound for bulk quantities of asparagus. So for value added processing, freezing, basically. Typically wholesale is going to be about here about $1.50 to $2 a pound fresh. If you have a premium product though, especially if it's early or you aren't leaving those plugs on the end and you've got a really fresh product, people will pay more. Retail. So I checked before this presentation just to see what local supermarkets were selling it for. $3 a pound is the lowest. So that means as a local grower, you should never go below that. And I would recommend actually selling a quantity less than a pound in a smaller bundle for $3-4, which would come out to be $8-9 a pound. Any off-season produce, asparagus is going to bring a bit more. Let's talk competition though. What's going on worldwide? And this is really interesting to me. The Michigan asparagus growers have been paying attention to this quite a bit. And in fact, when so they had a 5-6 hour webinar on asparagus that they had various speakers that I sat in on. A lot of the information from Michigan came from that, but they had the Michigan Asparagus Growers Association and they talked about some of the foreign imports. When they talked about it, because this was Zoom being broadcast nationwide, they would not release their price figures or discuss those publicly. And I thought that was really interesting. Foreign imports of asparagus, not just during the winter from Peru or early season stuff from Mexico, but year round, imports are increasing. Some of the Mexican asparagus, for example, they just continue harvesting it way late in the season, which is why you see really spindly asparagus that's really small. It's because they're really pushing their plants far further than they really should be, because they're wanting to capture that market and take away from growers up here, for example, and compete with that market. So they're offering a cheaper product grown with cheaper labor. The other competitor in asparagus is Canada. So Canada offers a product that's a little bit later than what New York State grows, than what Michigan grows. They've got a pretty robust industry. And we're also seeing those winter imports from Peru. So if you're getting fresh asparagus for your Thanksgiving dinner, or for your Christmas dinner, I should say, actually Thanksgiving too, it is probably from South America in most cases. So if you are a grower, this is your competition. You have the Oceania region in Michigan that does asparagus by the ton, acre after acre. You've got growers in California and Pennsylvania that have been doing this much longer. Delmarva Peninsula in Virginia, Maryland, those areas. There are a lot of places in the country and the world that grow asparagus. So you have to ask yourself, why should a customer pay for your product, and why should they pay a higher price? What sets your stuff apart from others? And I believe that is going to be the freshness of that product, that taste that you get, that sweetness from asparagus that's only a couple hours old or maybe a couple days old at most. Really try and get it in the consumer's hands as quickly as possible. So some other resources, and I love Gary Larson. I cuss, you cuss, we all cuss for asparagus. I don't know if that'll catch on or not, but the Cornell Asparagus Bulletin is a great resource for home gardeners. Carl Cantalupi, the gentleman from Penn State that I talked about, he is a conventional grower who is a heavy herbicide and pesticide user. So if you're an organic grower, do not invest in his bulletin. But if you are thinking of large scale asparagus growing in a conventional setting, this is kind of the Bible on that topic. The man he lives and breathes asparagus. He continues in his retirement to do research on asparagus plots. For those of you in Pennsylvania, he is a wonderful resource on this topic. So I would recommend contacting him and talking to him. In the Oceania region of Michigan, for any of you that are in Michigan, Ben Whirling is kind of the guru there for asparagus production in that area. His publications on asparagus are outstanding. So the one linked here is a great document for looking at commercial production. So some of the cost and expected returns that go into that. I highly recommend looking at this and looking at what Ben has published. Both of these two are excellent resources that are probably the best in the Northeast, and that are, for our part of the world, are appropriate to read. You don't want to go reading California publications or different things like that. So I'll send these out so that you guys have those links, but I definitely recommend at least the Michigan State information because it is free to download, freely available. So my contact information, this is one of Ben's jokes. What do you call an indecisive vegetable? Asparagus. So bad joke, I know. Feel free to email me, msn62@cornell.edu. Now I'm going to stop sharing, and let me try and get into chat. No questions. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Please open your microphone if you want, or place them into chat.
Hey, Mike. Kurt
Hey, Kurt.
Lanning. Hey, what is considered light harvesting in year 2?
Yeah, so basically you're going to use that rule that if the spears are getting less than a pencil size, stop. So the plant's going to tell you that's the rule of thumb. I'm of the opinion that once you get a couple spears per plant, to stop as well. But it depends on how hard you want to push those plants. I personally would rather see them get a good, healthy start, get established in that first or second year, rather than trying to push them for a profit. Because again, this is a 30-year venture in most cases. Asparagus is there for a long time. Let them get a good start. Wait a little bit. What other questions?
I got one more for you.
Yeah.
What if your seasonal people and your asparagus doesn't die before you leave? Can you just leave it?
Yes, you can. And so that'll be the situation where you're keeping the stubble, you're keeping the snow cover, the ground's going to be insulated, and you will delay emergence because the soil will stay colder longer. If you start having issues with asparagus beetle, that really becomes the question of whether you need to mow and take care of it. But generally just letting it stand is absolutely fine. Typically we see that the asparagus beetle in monoculture situations where there are acres and acres of this stuff. I have had it in my home garden though, but birds, chickens, other things tend to take care of it just fine. So it really depends on your cultivation practices. I've done nothing special to get rid of asparagus beetle though. I noticed it, said, oh, squished a couple of them, and then put some birdhouses up, and the birds have taken care of most of it.
I have a question.
Yes.
I don't know, 20, 25 years. Figure out exactly when we planted it, but it started growing up really plants, and then it did the same thing the year after. So we just thought at that point the plant has had it, so we just dug it all up, and we actually haven't replanted it. So last year was the first year we didn't have any asparagus. So I'm really kind of thankful that. But do you think it's because the plant got too old that it started growing really thin spindles?
Yeah. So it could be various stresses. So a couple things: the plant spacing. If you have tight spacing initially, once the plants grow, they start competing with each other, and that will cause some of the spindly growth that you see. It could be that they started actually depleting some of the nutrients, and maybe top dressing or other methods like that would have helped to replenish it. So that's a possibility as well. It could be that if your spacing was tight, maybe removing every other one and then adding top dressing would have cured that. 25 years old though is getting at the end of an asparagus bed's life.
Yeah, okay, that's what we kind of thought, because they weren't very close together.
Yeah.
But all we had was like some asparagus plant food that we were giving them, so a lot of things that you talked about we didn't do when we grew it because we just didn't know how to. But so anyway, that's what I wanted to know, if that was after so many years, 20, 25 years, they say that's it, we're done.
Depletion of the soil and some of those allelopathic properties. So if you grow it there for a long time, some of the fungus and things build up over time. The plant struggles a little bit more, which is why for home gardeners, don't replant it in the same spot. Find a new spot.
Oh, okay, that's a good thing to know.
What other questions do you guys have?
Hey, Mike, it's Paul. Anybody talk about growing for flavor?
Yeah, they did a little bit in some of the Michigan State trials, but they didn't have a lot of information on it. I think that's going to be a topic that's going to come up in the Cornell University trials that they're doing. So Cornell is just now doing those. If you read today's Veg Edge newsletter that just came out, they're talking about those different trials, and I believe flavor is going to be an issue with that. In general, the really commercial guys, they're looking for quantity over quality, quite honestly. So flavor is not as much of a concern as an asparagus sphere.
Thanks.
By the way, the Europeans, on the other hand, and I should have mentioned this. So the European seed company that I mentioned, the Germans and the British are growing for flavor, and they are looking at that. So that may be a place to look for some varieties that have higher sugar content, different things like that. They're only available through seed, though, is the catch. You're not going to get crowns for them.
Well, I can say that I sell everything I grow, and I grow a lot of asparagus, and the biggest comment is flavor.
Yeah.
So I don't know what I'm doing right, but it would be really nice to see if someone's actually like researching why certain asparagus tastes so much better than other asparagus.
Yeah. One thing, your stuff's not 2 weeks old. By the way,
Yeah.
Paul Haldeman is our one asparagus grower in Jefferson County. I'll out you. So, and he does a marvelous crop. But yeah, I think your stuff's not 2 weeks old is the first thing. Because what chefs are getting is often pretty darn old and sitting in a warehouse for quite a while. So to me, that's the difference. I mean, the asparagus I picked the other night, cooking it quickly, it's sweet like candy in some ways, if you could taste the carbohydrates in it, versus stuff from other commercial, conventionally grown systems that are, the soils are depleted. So for those of you who don't know Paul's operation, he has an organic operation and some really great organic growing practices using natural systems and soils. And I believe that's part of what comes out in the flavor. But you're right, variety is going to be part of it too.
Well, I wondered, when you start putting these, and I don't know if it's the herbicides or the solvents or whatever they use to, I don't know if that can affect the flavor, if because those plants absorb just about everything they've got out there. And I can't imagine that, you buy that commercial stuff from, I don't know, the supermarket, it kind of tastes like a little tinge of, I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But I would love to know more about how what you put in the soil affects the flavors, of the asparagus.
Well, for one thing, mycorrhizal interactions are going to be killed when you're doing soil fumigation. So that's going to be an issue. There are a lot of factors with some of the commercial methods that also they're growing on sandier soils, which may be less nutrient rich, those sorts of things on top of it. I think there's a lot at play. That's a really dense question to get into, but I do think that organically grown stuff, in my opinion, tastes better without the chemicals. And some of those pesticides, they may be applied later in the year, even after harvest, but they do accumulate. So I think there is something to be said for organic systems. Now, the Penn State guy, he swore that it was impossible to grow asparagus organically. And I thought of you the entire time, but he didn't say impossible, but he said very difficult and not commercially viable. I should rephrase that. What else?
I totally understand where he's coming from, because it's really hard to grow large scale.
Yeah.
But I would love to talk to a guy like that, because he's got a lot of practical experience. But I think we've developed some ways to do it. Maybe not as large scale as he wants, but for a community of maybe 300,000 or 400,000 people, like the North Country, maybe 3 or 4 counties. I don't think you need to do that, but yeah, I'd love to talk to a guy like that, because I think there's a lot of knowledge to be shared.
Yes, he is wonderful. Like I said, the dude lives and breathes asparagus. Carl Cantalupi with Penn State. He's retired, but he's still doing research on his farm, which I think is incredible. He really cares about the subject matter. It's $25 for his bulletin, which he described as that thick and just everything a commercial grower would want to know. So to satisfy your curiosity about conventional commercial operations, I recommend getting that. It's a good document and the type of information that even though you're growing organically, there's some really neat tidbits in there worth looking at.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the info. I'd like to get that and take a look at that. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, let me pull that screen back up so that you've got yeah, so his is the second bulletin, Carl 1954 at ptd.net, and you can request that bulletin. Ben's, the Michigan State document's pretty darn good too on commercial growing. Well worth looking at. Any other questions?
Thank you so much for helping.
Oh, you're absolutely welcome. I love this topic. And
I was sort of scared to try, but I was just wondering how many crowns would you suggest that I plant if I'm going to go the crown route?
Mm-hmm. How big's your garden and how many people are in your family?
There's I have a lot of friends that come up, so usually I want to say I'm feeding about 10 people on the weekends, but there's only my husband and I in our family.
Okay, how big's your garden?
This is going to be the first year we just moved here, so my husband said I have a nice area, probably I want to say I think for the asparagus I want to do 12 by 14.
Okay.
Is that too big, or?
You could fill that entire area with asparagus. And it depends on how much space you have for gardening and how much you need for other crops. Because asparagus, again, is a big crop. It takes a lot of room. So going back to, let me find the slide, the spacing recommendations. So basically the space between the rows, if you were to tighten it up to 4.5 foot, so what did you just say, had 10 by 12? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So you're looking at, you could probably squeeze 3 rows in, but your asparagus is going to be bleeding over into the rest of your garden, falling over into it.
Well,
So
I'm
2 or
doing
3
it in
rows.
yeah, I'm doing it in an area where I'm not going to have anything else.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So at 12 inches of spacing for a 10 by 12, so that's 12 per row. And if you have 3 rows, then 36 plants.
Wow, that seems like I'll have a big yield though.
You will eventually. I find that I never have enough asparagus though.
That's right.
So we eat asparagus. It's the first thing that as soon as I see it, it gets eaten. And with 10 people, that's a lot of people to feed.
Yeah,
So,
coming in and out. Yes,
yeah.
that's great. Yes.
So yeah, you won't have enough.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I will say that if you don't have it, asparagus freezes beautifully. So let's say you do plant too much of it, blanch it. So pick it, blanch it immediately, get it into your freezer bags and put it in the freezer. And then you have it for the winter time.
That
So
sounds perfect.
yeah, so 36 crowns for you would be kind of a tight spacing on that, but I think you'd be okay doing that.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Mhm. What other questions are out there?
Hey,
I
Mike.
got it. Oh, sorry.
Yes.
No, go ahead.
So was there a question? I heard somebody say something.
Yes, thanks, Mike, for this too. My question is, I really probably only have the size of I'm going to do is probably like 10 feet by like 3 feet, so it's only good enough for one row. What
Yeah.
happens if you plant them closer than the 10 inches or the 12 inches? What will happen to the plants? Will they just not mature or be too
No,
too
they'll be
overcrowded?
fine. Yeah. So what you'll get is smaller spears. So again, the thickness of that spear depends on how robust the roots are. And if you get them a little bit closer, they're going to be competing with each other. So you won't necessarily get more asparagus. You'll get more smaller asparagus. So the quantity is going to be probably about the same, although you'll get it faster though. You'll get it in the first couple of years, or a larger quantity faster. But in the long run, bigger plants produce bigger spears. So yeah, you can tighten that spacing up, and they'll be fine.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And there was a question for a family of 2. I'd say an 8-foot row, 10-foot row. So if you did that 12-inch spacing, so 10 foot, 10 plants, and that'll be enough for a family to eat off. It really depends on how much you like asparagus. There are 2 people in my household. We have about a 10-foot row. Actually, we have like 3 10-foot rows, and I still never have enough. So again, consider what you want. But I'm asparagus crazy too, though. But I think, was there another question? I think 2 people tried to ask at once.
Yeah. Hey, Mike, it's Paul again. I just wanted to say I'm glad you mentioned the Guelph. The folks over at Guelph University have been doing a great job with asparagus, and I planted a whole field, probably, I don't know, probably 10 acres into a muck soil. Yeah. And it was just like an experiment, but if you have muck soils, it works. That stuff comes up and it does great. And,
that's good to know. Okay.
And it's also, not only is it muck, but it's also a frost pocket.
Yeah.
But I planted a lot deeper than you recommend. I go up to 2 feet down, anywhere from 2 feet to 24 inches in those areas, because that frost heave will separate the crowns from the roots. Right. So I just go way deeper, but you're going to get thicker spears and less spears. Yeah. But you can't. But what I found, a combination of that Guelph Millennium and a deeper planting, you can, if you do have just clay and muck and cold frost pockets, you can get away with it. And I can tell you, when we had that drought this summer, that was probably some of my best producers. When everything else was too dry, that muck and those low cold soils, they were producing when nothing else was. So,
and you didn't have to irrigate it.
So. I don't irrigate. I don't know. Sometimes right at the beginning, but no. Yeah. Good. And so, it's really, as you know, very soil site dependent. But I did have great success, and I was quite amazed at the job that the people at Guelph did at making stuff. I've tried to grow the Jersey varieties in those soils. No luck, but
interesting.
But that stuff very good. So if you have those conditions, the cold, mucky, clay, wet, frost pocket, if you use the Guelph and you go a little deeper than you would normally go, it works really well. I was surprised. Yeah, that's good to know then. That Millennium variety, I hear great things from lots of people about it. And I did not know about that aspect of it. So that's pretty fascinating. Yeah, I wish more companies offered it to home growers, which is one reason I did part of this on seed production, so that if you can't find these really good varieties, well, start them from seed. Order some seeds from Johnny's and start them yourself. But that's the first time I've ever seen Johnny's carry that, and that's a very good thing, because they are hard to find. Yeah, they really are. Glad you mentioned that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? So how many of you are going to plant asparagus now? Paul, I know you are, but anybody give me a thumbs up with the thing like that? So we've got a couple. Good. I'm so glad. I want to see the North Country covered with asparagus. We need more of it. And it's a healthy, delicious crop. So I'm so happy to have you guys here tonight. You have my contact information, and I'll send out the slides on this. Thank you for coming out. I've had fun doing this presentation, and happy asparagus growing. So if you have any commercial horticulture or consumer horticulture questions, feel free to contact Sue or I here at Cooperative Extension. Going once, going twice. Otherwise, I'm going to sign out. You guys have a great night. Thank you so much. Take care.